Hi, welcome back. History 358. Um, Last time we talked about the establishment of a one-party system in Russia following the October Revolution, how the Bolsheviks managed to secure power for themselves following the October insurrection, and how they moved to suppress and indeed outlaw all other political parties. When we talk about a one-party system or a one-party state, it's important to bear in mind that there's a close connection between the party as an institution and the institutions of state governance. And the way this worked following October and throughout the history of the Soviet Union up until the bitter end in 1991 is that party leaders, party officials, were tapped to staff state positions, government positions. To hold office in state institutions meant that you had to be a party member. So when we talk about a one-party state, we're talking about a system in which really it's very difficult uh, to disentangle the apparatus of the ruling party from the institutions of governance. They are closely, tightly merged, and that's a point I wanted to just touch on from last time. Um, at the end of the last lecture, we talked about the dissolution of the Constituent Assembly in January 1918. And I think that that was a kind of watershed moment because it showed that the new regime, the Bolshevik regime, was prepared and willing to use coercive, repressive means against their political opponents in order to retain power and achieve their ideological goal of constructing socialism, and from socialism ultimately forward to that endpoint destination on the Marxist model of historical progression, true communism. So what I want to do today, and let me put up the slides here right now, what I want to do today is explore this question of coercion, think about the role of violence in Bolshevik policy. So we'll pick up on this theme from last time, what we might think of as terror and violence as state strategies. We're talking here about the top-down, state-sponsored, party-sponsored use of violent, coercive policies. And so what I want to stress here, a point to think about, is that violence is a part of the Soviet project, the Soviet experiment, from the very beginning. Violence is not a sort of Stalin-era distortion introduced later on in the 1930s. Violence is there from the very beginning of the Soviet state, from the very inception of the Soviet project. And I want us to think a little bit about why that is and how to make sense of that. You know, how does a revolution that took as its goals peace, equality, justice, how does it justify the use of violence, coercion, and bloodletting in order to achieve those goals? When we think about the use of violence, I want to think about two related explanations that I think help us get closer to understanding why the Bolshevik leadership espouses and endorses the use of terror, the use of violence. And before we get to those two related um, points, I want to stress when we're talking about terror, I want to distinguish terror from terrorism. If we think of terrorism as a sort of weapon of the weak deployed by the powerless against powerful structures, terror, by contrast, is a top-down process. So when we're talking about terror as a state strategy, we're talking about, in this case, the Bolshevik regime's decision, willingness to use violence as state policy, to deploy, to wield violence from above, using the power of the state, using state institutions like the Cheka, to which we'll turn here momentarily. So the distinction I want to draw here is that terror is a top-down process. Terrorism, as a weapon of the weak, kind of bubbles up from below. So we're not concerned with terrorism here, but rather the state's use of violence. The German sociologist Max Weber, back at the turn of the 20th century, described the state, any state, as an institution that has a monopoly on violence. And the Soviet regime, the Bolshevik regime, establishes for itself a monopoly on the deployment of violence. And as we'll see, prepares a moral and ethical justification for using violence against its purported enemies, so-called class enemies. Okay, so just so we're clear on what we mean by terror, the deployment of violence by agents of the state. So two related explanations as to why the Bolshevik leadership espouses, endorses, gives its blessing to the use of terror. And one, I think, has to do with, again, the precariousness of the political position in which the Bolsheviks found themselves after October. They're trying to hold power in the face of determined opposition. And that becomes an even more pressing problem in the context of the Civil War, which breaks out in 1918, to which we'll turn. So we have to understand violence and the Bolsheviks' use of violence in connection to the relative weakness of the new regime, which we touched on last time. The other related explanation, I think, that gets us kind of into the Bolshevik mentality, why did the Bolsheviks endorse the use of terror? The Bolsheviks subscribed to this revolutionary dictum that the ends justified the means, and that when pursuing this revolutionary utopian dream of constructing paradise on earth, any means, any methods, no matter how bloody, no matter how costly, no matter how beyond the letter of the law they may be, could be justified in pursuit of that most noble of goals. So again, I think we have to think about theory and practice here. Revolutionary theory, revolutionary dogma, going back to the time of the Jacobins and the French Revolution, justified the use of violence in pursuit of noble goals. The Bolsheviks picked up that idea and ran with it. But we also have to see violence as a response to the very real precariousness, weakness of the Bolshevik regime in its earliest years. It was close to falling, and violence was a way to hold on to power and achieve those goals. So these two explanations are very much interconnected, very much interrelated. Now, remember, the Bolsheviks, at the turn of the 20th century, well before the revolution, had rejected terrorism as a legitimate means of revolutionary struggle. That was one of the great divides between the Bolsheviks on the one hand and the SRs on the other. The SRs are making bombs in the early 20th century, blowing up czarist ministers, police chiefs, generals, and so forth. The Bolsheviks said, this is ridiculous. You blow up one police chief, they appoint another. And that was the lesson that Lenin had learned from the tragic arrest and execution of his elder brother Sasha, who had been mixed up, as you'll recall, in one of those assassination attempts on Tsar Alexander III. The Marxists, taking the materialist view, said, all of this terrorist activity, blowing up a police chief, blowing up a minister, this is all just superficial action at the top. We need structural change. So how is it that when the Bolsheviks came to power, they came to embrace the use of violence? Early on, from the very beginning of the October Revolution, Bolshevik figures like Trotsky warned that once we take power, the reality is we will face determined and stiff opposition from our political enemies, and we must be prepared for this. Trotsky says, we will not waltz our way into the kingdom of socialism, wearing white gloves on a polished parquet floor. So the implication was the party must anticipate and be prepared for opposition. And the party must not be afraid to get its hands dirty, to pull off its white gloves if need be. And in the weeks that followed the October Revolution, pronouncements from the People's, from the Council of People's Commissars, Sovnarkom, from Lenin himself, made it very clear that the enemies of the revolution are against us, and we, the party representing the workers, peasants, soldiers, and sailors, must be prepared to take decisive action against our enemies. Lenin and the Bolsheviks called for a, quote, merciless suppression, a war to the death against the bourgeoisie and class enemies who threatened the revolution from within. So from the very beginning, there is this militant rhetoric. In the fall of 1917, after the revolution, Lenin issues warning after warning that the revolution is in peril, the revolution is in danger. From whom? From class enemies, from the bывшие люди, the former people, who have been now dispossessed by the revolution, and they are trying to claw their way back into power, by the bourgeoisie, who have been cast out of power by the workers' revolution, by the kulaks, the rich peasants who are trying to exploit the poor landless peasants. These class enemies, Tsarist officers, Orthodox clergymen, government ministers from the old regime, they are all in league against the power of the Soviets, against the power of the workers, peasants, soldiers, and sailors. And the party must fight against these enemies. Lenin, in the fall of 1917, speaks in terms of the class enemies mounting against the revolution. He says the bourgeoisie, the landowners, and all the propertied classes are making desperate efforts to undermine the revolution. How? They are prepared to commit the most heinous crimes. They have gone so far as to sabotage food distribution, threatening millions of people with famine. And note the language here. Again, the enemies are defined in class terms. The enemies are the bourgeoisie, the landowners, the propertied classes, the exploiters, right? And they are blamed for the very real problems of infrastructural collapse, problems of food supply, problems of economic speculation, hoarding, black marketing, profiteering, all of the very real socioeconomic ills that naturally befell the Russian people in the chaos of World War I and revolution are blamed by the new Bolshevik regime on the class enemies of the revolution. So there's a self-fulfilling logic to this. We are faced every day with problems of food supply. We're faced every day by problems of transportation breakdown, communication breakdown. A civil war is beginning. Who is to blame? Marxist dogma and party logic tells us that our class enemies are to blame. So the point to think about here is how enemies are defined. The enemies of the revolution, so-called counter-revolutionaries, are defined by the Bolshevik regime as class enemies, defined in class terms. Now, this kind of talk coming from Lenin may seem a bit unexpectedly harsh. After his death in 1924, Soviet propagandists tried to sort of reimagine, rebrand Lenin as this cuddly sort of figure who loved children and small animals. And here you see Lenin surrounded by a bunch of little kids as he's wearing his three-piece suit. The fact was that Lenin always, politically, favored coercion over consensus. And that is a fact reflected in the many unequivocal statements on revolutionary violence that Lenin issued in the period from 1917 through 1920. Just to give you a few examples, when faced with labor strikes by workers, this is what Lenin has to say at the end of December 1917. Shoot on the spot every 10th worker guilty of idleness who's not doing his fair share. At the middle of January 1918, Lenin says again in frustration, in a memo to Sovnarkom, the Council of People's Commissars, we cannot expect to get anywhere unless we resort to terror. Speculators must be shot on the spot. And by speculators, Lenin here refers to black marketeers, economic criminals who are hoarding grain, raising artificially the price of food, engaging in black market profiteering, counterfeiting, etc. Shoot them on the spot. In February of 1918, and you can see the widening cast of enemies here, in a burst of frustration, Lenin issues a decree in which he says enemy agents, spies, profiteers, hooligans, which was a Russian word adopted from the English to basically mean any kind of urban disturbance, street gangs, acts of mischief, looting, that sort of thing. But enemy agents, profiteers, hooligans, counter-revolutionary agitators, and German spies, to throw them into the mix, are to be shot on the spot. So again, this nice, cuddly, warm, gentle, avuncular Lenin. The reality is we are dealing, as we are dealing with all of these figures, we're dealing with hardcore professional revolutionaries. Lenin was not a warm and cuddly guy. So the word terror, again, is worth reflecting on. Lenin says we must use terror. And again, the Bolsheviks used terror in the same way that Robespierre and the Jacobins had used the word terror back in the French Revolution, back in the 1790s. Robespierre had famously defined terror as nothing more than justice, swift, merciless, and inflexible. And terror was a weapon that could be wielded by the revolutionary regime against its enemies. A weapon that could be wielded in the service of the revolution's aims, a weapon that could be wielded to achieve the goals and purpose of the revolution. So Bolshevik rhetoric, that is to say, Bolshevik political language, not only justified the use of violence and terror in service of the revolution's goals against the enemies of the revolution, but Bolshevik rhetoric transformed this use of violence into a virtue. On the very day that the Bolsheviks took power in October of 17, Lenin said, "It is an inadmissible weakness to think about a revolution without shooting. You cannot have a revolution without firing a few guns," he says. So the Bolsheviks, and this is a point I want to stress, the Bolsheviks did not revel in bloodletting, although many of their enemies charged them with, being just bloodthirsty, rapacious monsters. Revolutionary violence was very serious business to the Bolsheviks. They took it very seriously. They did not take this lightly, but they saw it always as justified, as completely necessary, as moral and ethical, because it served the larger interest of mankind. In a famous letter that Lenin wrote to American factory workers following the October Revolution, because again, remember, Lenin and the Bolsheviks believe that the revolution is going to spread around the world, and there are appeals after appeals issued from the new Bolshevik government to factory workers, proletarians across the industrial world, calling upon them to rise up, follow the Russian workers' lead, and overthrow the bonds of capitalism. Lenin, in a letter to American workers written just a few weeks after the revolution of 1917, makes it very clear that the Soviet state, the Bolshevik regime, does not glorify violence for its own sake. So he's trying to combat this kind of capitalist propaganda that seeks to portray the Bolsheviks as bloodthirsty bandits. He says, no, we are not bloodthirsty. Our violence, he says, is justified. Contrast what we are doing with what the Imperial West has been doing for 100 years. So Lenin zeroes in on World War I, and this is what he has to say. The international imperialist bourgeoisie have slaughtered 10 million people and maimed 20 million more in their war, World War I, to decide whether it will be British vultures or German vultures who rule the world. In our war, the war of the oppressed, the war of the exploited against the oppressors, and the exploiters. If our war should result in maybe 500,000 or 1,000,000 casualties across the world, the bourgeoisie will say that their casualties are justified while our casualties are criminal. So Lenin is saying there's a hypocritical double standard. No one blinks an eye when imperialist powers send millions of men to die in needless wars for the interests of capital and profit. No one says anything wrong about that. But we go out and shoot a few counter-revolutionaries and everyone's attacking us for being bloodthirsty bandits. So I think this is a good example of how Lenin and the Bolshevik Party were trying to make sense of, in a comparative context, the use of violence. Violence as used by the workers and peasants government against exploiters versus the violence that the imperialist world was deploying against workers and other oppressed. Lenin says terror is just and legitimate when the French and English bourgeoisie resort to it for their own benefit, but terror is monstrous and criminal should the workers and peasants dare to use it against the bourgeoisie. So again, this need to deploy violence, this need to deploy terror has to be seen in the context of how weak the Bolshevik government was when it came to power. Remember, observers at the time said, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, they'll fall. The Bolshevik government, the Bolshevik leaders themselves, the new commissars, thought that their regime might fall any day. So it's in the context of weakness that terror was deployed to hold on to power. Lenin and Trotsky and other Bolshevik leaders were constantly warning that only strong measures can save the revolution from its enemies. So, how was revolutionary violence deployed? The principal agent of revolutionary violence was an organization founded by order of the Council of People's Commissars, Sovnarkom, on December 7th, 1917, the Extraordinary Commission for the Struggle Against Counter-Revolution and Sabotage, known by its Russian initials as ЧК, Чрезвычайная комиссия, the Extraordinary Commission, ЧК. The immediate task of the ЧК was to combat economic crime and political crime, to root out looting, acts of hooliganism, acts of black market trading, profiteering, all of which had increased at alarming rates in the urban centers of Russia over the fall and winter of 1917. The ЧК was also authorized by Sovnarkom to keep tabs on so-called enemy organizations, to keep tabs on the бывшие люди, the former people, to keep tabs on political oppositions, Mensheviks, SRs, cadet liberals, etc. So the ЧК was intended to be the eyes and ears and fighting fists of the new regime, to be the fighting fists of the revolution. The first syllable of ЧК, extraordinary, is worth a bit of reflection. Why was it called the Extraordinary Commission? It was called the Extraordinary Commission in the sense that it was empowered from its inception to operate outside the law, to operate outside the parameters of established legality. The ЧК, from its very creation, was given essentially a free hand to carry out its own investigations, to carry out its own searches, its own arrests, and even issue, on its own authority, summary death sentences. So Lenin, in creating the ČK, is again looking back to the French Revolution for inspiration. He sees that the ČK will be the domestic watchdog of the revolution, that its members will serve the revolution just as the Committee of Public Safety back in the day of the Jacobins had served the French Revolution, right? Rooting out enemies, saboteurs, counter-revolutionaries, bringing them before the guillotine, dispensing with enemies with swift, inflexible, unsparing justice. And Lenin says to head this organization, we need to find someone who is utterly uncorruptible, someone who is completely, utterly devoted to the cause of revolution. Lenin says we need our own Saint-Just, and Saint-Just was the fanatic Jacobin who had sent so many enemies of the revolution to the guillotine back in the 1790s before he himself fell beneath its blade. So we need our own Saint-Just. Where to find this man purely devoted to the revolution? Lenin's choice settles on a Polish-born Bolshevik named Felix Dzerzhinsky, Iron Felix, as he was known within the party, because of his rigid discipline, his revolutionary purity, his complete devotion to the cause. Dzerzhinsky had spent nearly half of his 40 years, most of his adult life, inside Tsarist prisons. He had been arrested 6 times. Here you see another photograph of Dzerzhinsky. The American journalist Louise Bryant, who was in Russia in the revolutionary years, traveled across the country, met with revolutionary leaders, described Dzerzhinsky as shy, aloof, and deeply puritanical. He can neither understand weaknesses in others, for he himself possesses a fanatical devotion that makes it possible for him to travel the hard, bitter road where his ideals and principles have led him. He needs only to be convinced that his course is righteous. Nothing else matters. Dzerzhinsky was described by his admirers as a monk in soldier's clothing. He was a workaholic. He spent 16, 18 hours a day on the clock. He slept on a couch in his office. And as you can see from this 1926 death date, he wore himself out. He died of a heart attack shortly after delivering a speech at a party congress, stepped off the podium, dropped dead. But the Cheka that Dzerzhinsky leads, the Cheka was intended to be just a temporary measure during the chaos of civil war, part of the dictatorship of the proletariat. Eventually, we will not need this measure, the government said. But in reality, the Cheka persisted to the very end of the Soviet period. It underwent all sorts of name changes, NKVD, MVD, KGB, by which you are probably most familiar with it. But this institution of state security, empowered to deploy violence against enemies, real and purported, remained in existence. Its power remained in effect until 1991. Dzerzhinsky describes the purpose of the Cheka. He says, terror is an absolute necessity during times of revolution. We terrorize enemies of the Soviet government in order that we may stop crime at its inception. That's a very interesting way of thinking about it. Not only stopping the criminals who have committed crime, but anticipating who enemies might be. We stop crime at its inception. Well, how do you know who the enemy is going to be? This eerie, unsettling phrase, enemy of the people, enemy of the revolution, begins to creep into official documents at the very end of 1917 and throughout 1918 and beyond. And again, the ranks of these so-called enemies swelled to include all of the so-called class enemies. So to be an enemy of the people meant that you came from or had connections to one of these social economic classes that was automatically branded as unreliable and suspect by the new Bolshevik regime. Dzerzhinsky's deputy, Martin Latsis, explained to his officers in November 1918 that we are not waging war, he says, against individual persons. we are waging war against class enemies. Latsis goes on. We are exterminating the bourgeoisie as a class. And then Latsis tells his deputies in the Cheka how they should proceed with their work. He says, during an investigation, you need not look for evidence that the accused has acted in deed or word against Soviet power. Don't look for evidence. The first question you need to ask are, to what class does the suspect belong? What is the class origin of the accused? What is his education? What is his profession? It is these questions that ought to determine the fate of the accused. In this lies the significance and essence of Red Terror. Red Terror, again, red, the color of the Bolsheviks, the color of the socialist revolution. Red Terror is the violence wielded by the state against its enemies. But Latsis's words here are very, very telling. You don't actually have to have evidence that the accused has committed a crime or even spoken out against Soviet power. All you need to do to identify the enemy as an enemy is to know his or her class origins. That tells you all you need to know. If he's a member of the bourgeoisie, if he's the son of a priest, if he's a former czarist officer, he is automatically, by virtue of his class association, an enemy of the revolution, an enemy of the people, and must be dealt with accordingly, because we are eliminating the bourgeoisie and all of its henchmen. We are eliminating this class. We're not talking about racial genocide, as the Nazis would deploy it a few decades down the road, but we are talking about a thoroughgoing, politicized mass murder, extermination, cleansing, if you will, of entire social classes for which there is no place in the new Soviet society. So that quote by Latsis, I think, is absolutely chilling, and it ties back to that reversal of the social pyramid that I mentioned last time. The revolution has turned the world upside down. Before the revolution, to have a glittering family tree that you could trace back through generations of aristocrats and noblemen, that is what secured you privilege of place under the czars. Now, that is a death sentence. And now, after 1917, to have impeccable class origins means that you come from worker stock, or that you come from a poor peasant family. Because if you come from one of these so-called former people, the bывшие люди, you are automatically under suspicion of being a class enemy. Now, again, if you think back to the ABC of communism, Bukharin and Preobrazhensky say that, well, just because you're a member of the bourgeoisie doesn't mean we have to kill you. There are some that we will win over to our side, and we'll come back to that point in a moment. But for the most part, the irredeemable, those who cannot be made to see the reason of revolution, we're going to have to get rid of them. This is one of my favorite posters from the immediate post-revolutionary period. We see Comrade Lenin with a red broom standing atop the globe, and the caption reads, "Comrade Lenin sweeps the earth of filth." Lenin was fond of saying that a new broom sweeps clean, an old proverb. And what you see here is Lenin forcibly, coercively, removing, sweeping away the old order. We see the German Kaiser and some other monarch and a big-bellied capitalist with a sack of money and a priest. There is no room for these exploiters. There is no room for these class enemies in the new world that the Bolsheviks are building, that they are preparing. I want to also just draw your attention now, and we'll develop this theme later, but this idea of social hygiene, this idea of sanitation, becomes part of the imagery and language of Soviet propaganda. The idea that these class enemies are polluting influences, that they are corrupting society from within, And for the good of the organism, for the good of revolutionary society, for the good of the new order that we're building, these enemies need to be swept away. They need to be excised. They need to be cut out. So this project of social sanitation, a kind of hygienic approach to managing the problem of enemies within, is right there from the very beginning of the Soviet state. The first concentration camps in Russia open up in 1918. By 1922, there are 190 concentration camps in Soviet Russia with 85,000 inmates. And these are, again, members of the former people, class enemies, political oppositionists. Just a brief note about concentration camps. These are not extermination camps. These are not death camps along the Nazi model. So we're not talking about Auschwitz or Treblinka or the infamous, horrific death camps that the Nazis would build in the 1940s. These are concentration camps where the enemies of the revolution can be concentrated, kept to themselves, quarantined, so that they will not corrupt and contaminate the body politic. We'll talk more about Soviet views of the prison system and the purpose of corrective labor, which is very, very different, I want to stress, from the Nazi vision. So we really have to have a sense of what's going on here. A lot of the individuals who were sentenced to a term in a Soviet concentration camp, 5 years for economic speculation, 10 years for political activity against the Soviet regime, there would always be a line at the end of the sentence from the Revolutionary Tribunal saying, in the event of the victory of global socialist revolution, the sentence will be commuted, because we won't need to quarantine our enemies anymore once socialism is won. So there's this kind of fascinating inner logic. This is not, again, violence for the sake of violence. This is violence for the sake of building the revolution forward to socialism. And once we have, then we can deal lightly with our enemies, if need be. So again, violence is a product of the weakness in which the regime finds itself. And the most obvious example of this weakness is the Civil War. I'll turn to the Civil War in another lecture, but this revolutionary violence intensifies in the period 1918 to 1921, which is perhaps, up until World War II at least, the most tumultuous period in Soviet history. You have famine, as we'll see, you have economic ruin, you have a complete collapse of transportation networks, communication networks, the regime is falling apart, the country is engulfed in civil war, and political opponents of Bolshevism are working to topple the new regime. On the afternoon, I'll come back to these pictures in another lecture. On the afternoon of August 30th, 1918, Lenin goes to a factory in Moscow. He addresses a group of workers. He ends his speech with these fiery lines: "With us, there is only one way forward, victory or death." He's walking back to his automobile at 7:30 p.m., and he is wounded by 3 shots fired point blank from a Browning revolver by a lone gunman, or gunwoman, I should say, Fanya Kaplan, who was an SR. One of the bullets lodged beneath Lenin's shoulder blade. Another one was caught in the right side of his neck. The third bullet shattered his left shoulder. So Lenin was very gravely wounded. That same day in Petrograd, an SR assassin, an SR terrorist, assassinated Moisey Uritsky, the head of the Petrograd Cheka. When the Bolsheviks learned that Lenin has been gravely wounded. Uritsky has been assassinated, killed. There's panic in the party. This is evidence that our enemies are lined up against us. Kaplan was immediately taken into custody. She was interrogated by Cheka agents who asked her, "Who are you working for? Are you part of a grand conspiracy?" Kaplan said, "I'm on my own." And all the evidence seems to suggest that she really was working alone. She was not part of a grand conspiracy. The guy who shot Uritsky, maybe. But Kaplan, when she shot Lenin, claimed that she was acting alone. And I want to just read you very briefly what she said, or what she is said to have said, in the official deposition that she gave. Kaplan said, "I shot Lenin because I believed he is delaying the socialist ideal by decades. I decided to take this step back in February, months before August. The Bolsheviks are conspirators. They have seized power without the consent of the people. I made the attempt on Lenin's life entirely by myself." Now, I mention this only because we're reading this week uh, Rosa Luxemburg's critique of the Bolshevik Revolution. So I want you to think about how there are criticisms of Bolshevik policy coming not only from liberals and right-wingers, but within the broad camp of left-wing socialist activity, there are figures like Kaplan who see the Bolsheviks as destroying the spirit of the revolution. Rosa Luxemburg will take Lenin and the Bolsheviks to task for their excessive use of violence. So I want to think also in our discussion this week about critiques coming against Bolshevism from within the socialist camp. In any case, Kaplan, just days later, was executed, her body burned by the Cheka, cremated without a trace. So the assassination of Uritsky, the attempt on Lenin's life, Lenin did recover, but he was badly wounded for months to come. This pair of assassination attempts, one successful, one not, convinced the party that, again, our enemies are in league against us. And so the party is already inclined to see enemies anywhere and everywhere. Now this justifies their suspicion. There are enemies within Russia who would seek to destroy the revolution, and they are in league with enemies outside of Russia, the enemies of imperialism, capitalism, and the bourgeoisie who want to tear down the revolution. So the reaction within the party and in the party-controlled press was swift and bloodthirsty. We have been dealt a blow. We must respond with our own blow. Just to give you one example here, the newspaper, Krasnaya Gazeta, the Red Paper, was the official organ of the Red Army, the Soviet Army. And this is the editorial published the day after the assassination attempts. "Without mercy, without sparing, we will kill our enemies in the scores of hundreds. Let them be thousands. Let them drown themselves in their own blood. For the blood of Lenin and Uritsky, let there be floods of blood of the bourgeoisie. More blood, as much blood as possible." The Cheka is the organ deployed by the state in this new period of red terror, which we can date to the end of August 1918. Official statistics show that throughout 1918 and the first half of 1919, the Cheka arrested 87,000 men and women on charges of counter-revolutionary activity. At least 8,389 of them were shot without trial. Again, the Cheka has that power. Government decrees and party pronouncements praise the Cheka for their vigilance. The party newspaper, Pravda, which means the truth, called upon ordinary citizens to endorse this wave of revolutionary violence unleashed against class enemies. The editors of Pravda address the proletariat, workers. The time has come. when either you must destroy the bourgeoisie or it will destroy you. Prepare for a mass, merciless onslaught upon the enemies of the revolution. The towns must be cleansed of this bourgeois putrefaction. Again, that language of medicalized contamination, right, of rot that has set in and that must be excised, right? All who are dangerous to the cause of the revolution must be exterminated. Exterminated. That notion of social extermination and the justification of social extermination appears again and again in Bolshevik pronouncements. Grigory Zinoviev, the party boss of Petrograd, delivers a speech in September of 1918 as the Red Terror is ramping up. He tells a crowd of workers, to overcome our enemies, we must deploy socialist militarism. Talk about what that may mean here in a moment. Of the 100 million people in Soviet Russia, we must win over to our side 90 million. For the rest, we have nothing to say to them. They must be exterminated. Again, this language of extermination, just as you would exterminate, verminous pests, as you would exterminate, bugs and vermin that have infiltrated the home, so too these enemies must be exterminated. We have nothing to say to them, Zinoviev says. The irony, if you look at Zinoviev's death date, 1936, Zinoviev himself is exterminated by Stalin during the years of terror in the late 1930s. But this idea that the enemies of the revolution have encircled the regime, that they're trying to destroy the socialist revolution on the home front through acts of terrorism, on the battlefield with the ongoing civil war, all of this served to escalate calls for revolutionary violence and to justify the idea that violence in the service of the revolution's goals was legitimate. Because again, the cause of the revolution is just, it is right, it cannot be anything else than just and right. And if we are creating an egalitarian, classless society, a radiant socialist future, the ends always justify the means. A chilling photograph from the fall of 1918, this taken in Petrograd. Members of the provincial council there that governed the province of Petrograd, the former capital. Death to the bourgeoisie and their henchmen. Long live the Red Terror. And you see here a group of young men. The kid on the left is barely a teenager, barely old enough to shave. They've got memorial wreaths to celebrate and honor the fallen hero of the revolution, Uritsky, and they are pronouncing vengeance upon Uritsky's killers, pronouncing vengeance upon an entire class. It's not just death to the murderer of Uritsky, death to the bourgeoisie and its henchmen. So again, we are waging war against an entire class of enemies. I'm going to jump ahead. We'll talk about the Civil War here in a moment. And it was a terribly violent, terribly horrific period. But the violence that we see in this era of Red Terror, from 1918 to 1921-22, coinciding with the escalating and widening Civil War, again, I think a lot of this has to do with the relative weakness and insecurity of the Bolsheviks' position at the time. If you think about violence as a state strategy in general, this is not a weapon wielded by governments that are secure and strong. It's a defensive measure, if you will, wielded by governments that are weak. And so I think the Red Terror, the state-sponsored violence against purported enemies that we see during the period 1918 to 1921 is a symptom of how unstable, how precarious the Bolsheviks' position was during this period. They lacked the authority for normal day-to-day administration over this wide, far-flung territory, and so they tried to use coercion and violence because an appeal for consensus was impossible. There are long-lasting consequences of the regime's use of Red Terror. What we see here is the beginning, the genesis, the roots of what will become the ethos, the guiding spirit of Stalinism in the 1930s and 40s. Stalinism will fully embrace the idea that violence, coercion, and force are acceptable, that they are to be approved of in the service of furthering the revolution, serving the interests of the state. That blood can and ought to be spilled if necessary in order to achieve the revolution's desired goals. So we'll see that when we get to the Stalin era, but I want to stress here that violence is there from the very beginning. Sometimes you'll encounter this artificial and completely irrational notion that, well, Lenin was okay, Stalin was bad. Stalin was the one who hijacked the revolution, took it off course. Stalin, as we'll see, was a faithful Leninist. And one of the things that Stalin learned from his master, Lenin, was that violence was part and parcel of building the socialist experiment. You could not achieve the new order through any other means. Bukharin and Preobrazhensky point to this in the ABC of communism, and the Red Terror that we see is, I think, a clear example. As Lenin famously said, a revolution without firing squads is useless. I want to stop here. We'll pick up on the theme of violence. In our next lecture, we'll talk about the Civil War, which was an era coinciding with the era of Red Terror, an era of intense bloodshed, intense horror. So we'll turn to that momentarily. But I'll stop this lecture now, if I can figure out how to do it. And I will see you in our next conversation. Thanks.